All right. So, we're still discussing factor markets. This is one of the longer topics, so we only probably got through like a quarter last week. So this week, let's see. Let's do a little bit of review, and then we'll start with the new stuff. Okay. So factor markets, the first thing we started talking about our discussion with is how factor markets are different than product markets. So what do you guys remember, like, in terms of how they're different? Who is the buyer and who's the seller in factor market? Frida, are households the buyer or the sellers in factor market?
Households are the buyers and the firms are the sellers.
Okay. Is that the product market or the factor market?
The product market.
Yes. So that's what I want you to remember.
The factor market, households are the sellers and firms are the buyers.
Good. And resource or factor market, households, sells, and farms are the buyer. Right, so that's the main distinction between these two types of markets. So far, this makes more sense to you because this is what we have been focusing on up until now. We haven't really talked about the resource market, or how is it that we know that in order to make products, farms need resources. They need to hire people, they need to buy land, or whatever else, right? They have to hire resources in order to make products, but we haven't really looked into these resource markets in depth at all. So this is what we're going to try to do, or we tried looking into starting last week. So then we looked at the 4 factors of production, right? Labor, land, capital, entrepreneurship. And I told you guys that for the purposes of this class, and also in keeping with how the College Board sets the exams, we're mostly going to be focusing on labor as the primary factor of production. The analysis that we do is mostly going to be related to the labor market. Okay. And labor as a factor of production, it's mostly, we talked about workers. Land is any type of natural resources that you can find and that you can use to make other stuff, so wood, water, timber, anything else that you can imagine, like that already exists in nature. Capital, we talked about tools, machines, buildings. And entrepreneurship is somebody who combines all of these other 3 factors, and either they make something new or they modify something that is already existing. Okay. And then we talked about factor payments, which is what farms have to pay in order to hire each one of these types of factors. So of course, farms cannot get these factors of production for free because somebody owns them, and those somebody are households, right? So for labor, the factor of payment is wages. For land, it's rent. And for capital, it's interest. And these prices are determined, just like in the product market, prices are determined in the market by the forces of supply and demand. It works the same way here. The market forces of supply and demand determine the price for these resources. Then I took you guys, or we did a brief overview of the circular flow diagram, just to show you how these 2 concepts of the product market and factor market are interrelated, and we can't really have one without the other. So the product market, we said, this is where farms sell and households buy. The factor market is where farms buy and households are selling, right? And we looked at the flow of inputs and outputs in these with these dashed arrows, and the flow of money, where money is flowing from whom to from where to where. We looked at it through the we followed it through the solid arrows. Okay. um so let's see. Then what we did was, we said that we would be mostly focusing on one factor, which is labor. um, and we started our discussion of the labor market by focusing on the perfectly competitive labor market. So this is just to let you know that this is not the only type of labor market that exists. There can be imperfect competition in labor market as well. Just like with product markets, we had perfectly competitive product market, we had monopoly, we had monopolistic competition and oligopoly. We have a similar situation in the resource market as well. Okay, it's just that there are not as many, but at least we're gonna take a look at one of them, which is called the monopsony. Okay, so this is something that we're gonna come back to later. So we started talking about the perfectly competitive labor market, and we made some assumptions, just like we always do in economics. So one of the assumptions with the perfectly competitive labor market is that there are many, many, many small farms that hire just as many workers that have identical skills and abilities. So you'll hear, when we talk about the perfectly competitive labor market, you will see that so many of these things are similar to what we talked about with perfectly competitive product market. So with product market, there were also small farms, and the product that they were selling were identical. So it's the same idea here, that there are many small farms that are hiring, and they are hiring workers that have identical skills and abilities. Okay. And no one farm is large enough to manipulate the market. So each farm is really, really, really small compared to the entire market, and they don't really have any sort of market power. And the wage is constant, and it is determined by the market supply and demand. Just like with perfectly competitive product market, we saw that the price was constant, right? And it was set, the market price was determined by the forces of supply and demand. It was a constant price. Okay. And individual farms in perfectly competitive labor market are also what known as wage takers. We saw what is similar to the perfectly competitive product market here is that individual farms in perfectly competitive product market were price takers. So remember that wage. Yeah, Sarah?
Is well, yeah, the fast fashion industry, like the textile industries, like in Bangladesh and those types of countries, is that considered a perfectly competitive labor market? Like, I'm just trying to look for an example.
Um, I don't think that would be. So, what makes you consider that as a perfectly competitive labor market?
Because there's a lot of poverty, and so the laborers, like, they don't get to, like how it says there, that they don't need to raise the wage in order to attract the workers, because workers just like take the price that they have to like, work for, and all the factories like have the same like wage set.
That depends. So
Wow.
I don't really know as much about the. So you would have to pay everybody so at a flat rate. Okay. So
Oh.
it's not like, I'm sure in the garment factories there are different tiers of wages. So maybe if somebody starts out at a basic level, they might get a same wage rate. But you everybody. So just like we talked about with perfectly competitive product market, the idea is sort of like it's an ideal. Okay, it's like rare to find.
Oh.
So it's sort of similar, because here you would be talking, yes, you are talking about very low skilled workers, that have, so we're not really talking about highly skilled workers like lawyers or surgeons, because of course in those industries we would not see anything like that because nobody has identical skills and abilities. But you can sort of assume that this will happen in a very let's say, like, one example might be like, how people hire workers by the roadside, to like work them in construction and whatnot. Or if you need like manual labor to do for some kind of um, here it sort of works this way. Here I've seen like there are um, in LA or other industries where there are like a lot of immigrants. So like people will like sort of gather by some sort of a corner in downtown, and some people will come by with a truck or something, and they need some workers to like help them with some construction work or whatnot. And it's like these people have the exact same skills and abilities, and they're all going to be hired for the same exact rate. Okay. So it's sort of like that, because I'm not so sure that fast fashion, maybe like the sweatshops might have something similar, but not quite the same idea. So yeah, hope that helps.
Yes.
Okay, great. So individual farms here are also price takers. Remember that the price of labor that farms need to make, we call that wage, right? So same idea that they're wage takers or price takers. They just have to accept the market price that has been set by the market as given, and that is the wage that they have to pay to the workers that they hire. Okay, so they don't need to raise wage in order to attract more workers. So when we look at the other type of markets, imperfectly competitive labor markets, they have to do this. Okay, they have to raise wage in order to attract more workers, but not the perfectly competitive labor market. So they don't have to pay anybody more in order to hire the next person. They can just pay everybody the market wage rate, and at that wage they would be able to hire as many people as they possibly could. Okay, and for the same reason they wouldn't be able to lower the wage either, because if you are one farm and everybody else that wants to lower their wage and everybody else is paying the market rate, if you are a worker, you're just going to go to the next farm with your skills and they're going to pay you at least the market rate. Okay, so this is why they can't lower the wage, but they don't have no need to increase the wage either. So here we just looked at a side-by-side graph of the perfectly competitive product market and the perfectly competitive factor market or labor market. So the price for the product market is price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, and the demand of the intersection of supply and demand gave us equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And in the factor market or the labor market, wage, which is the price of labor, is on the vertical axis, and the quantity of labor is on the horizontal axis. And demand for labor is downward sloping, and supply of labor, the intersection of these two things gave us the equilibrium wage rate and then the equilibrium quantity of workers that are going to be hired. Okay. Then we looked at the demand for labor, which is basically, just like demand for, product, right? Demand is willingness to pay, right? So, and then the people that are on the demand side here are the farms, right? The farms are the one that wants to hire workers. So it's how many workers businesses are going to be willing and able to hire at different wages. Okay, and what we see here is that at higher wage rates at W1, the quantity of labor that is going to be higher is this quantity L1, and then at a lower wage W2, we see that there is an increase. The quantity demanded increases. We're over here at L2, right? So there is an inverse relationship between price of labor and then the demand for labor. So if price rises, if wage increases, farms will demand less labor, and if wage decreases, they will demand more labor, which makes sense to us because wages are what for farms? They're costs. Okay, so if it's more costly to hire somebody, you want to hire less. If it's less costly, you want to hire more. Okay, and then what we did here with was look into this idea or this thing called the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, so what the marginal revenue product of labor it allows us to do is we if we are a farm, our main idea or our goal is to what? Maximize our profit. Okay, so profit, as we know, is total revenue minus total cost. So remember here, we're not looking at it from the perspective of selling outputs. Okay, so here we're looking at it from the perspective of factor or resources. Okay, so this marginal revenue product of labor is just sort of understanding one side of the equation, which is the revenue side. Okay, and then later we're going to look at the cost side. Okay, what this marginal revenue product of labor essentially allows us to do is, if you are a profit maximizing farm and you have made a decision about this is how many outputs I'm going to make this month, and I need to hire this many workers in order to be able to do that. Okay, so it's not enough for you to just finding out how much value or how much additional revenue a worker can bring you is like a crucial element of this. Okay, so farms don't hire workers for the sake of because it's socially beneficial, or it makes them feel good to do that, right? They only hire workers for the purposes of being able to that they're going to be able to help them sell products and they can maximize profits. So then you really need to be able to determine if there is any value to hiring an additional worker. Okay, and that is exactly what this thing allows us to understand. Like, look at it from dollar, I guess, monetary perspective, that if there is, what is the value that this worker can bring for me if I hire this next person. Okay, so what is the additional revenue that this person is going to bring to me when I hire this next person? Okay, so the marginal revenue product of labor, the formula looks like this, and it's just the change in total revenue if there is a change in labor. Okay, so how much additional revenue does or how much additional revenue does the farm make or when they hire an additional worker? Okay, so once we rearrange this equation or manipulate it a little bit, we arrived at this thing, which is marginal revenue product of labor is the product of the marginal revenue and the marginal product of labor. Okay, so marginal revenue, right? So let's just take a look at the table that we looked at last time to give us some more clarity about why this is important and what it is that this thing really tells us. Okay, so the marginal revenue product, so we said that we assumed that we're talking about a bakery, and then the product that they're selling are loaves of bread, and this bakery can hire anywhere from 0 to 6 workers, and this column is the total product, this column was the marginal product, and this was the marginal revenue column. So here we saw that the marginal revenue was equal to price. And why were we able to do that, you guys? I talked about this last time. Hello? Does anybody remember?
No.
No. Okay, so the reason we were able to do that is because aside from, assuming that we are in a perfectly competitive labor market, we also assume that we are in a perfectly competitive product market. Okay, and we know that in perfectly competitive product market, price is equal to marginal revenue, because every time you sell one more of this item, you're only going to be making, the additional revenue is only going to be equal to the price, because that price is fixed. So this is what we know from perfectly competitive product market. So this is why I can do this, right? MR is equal to pre. And I see that, I assume that each loaf of bread sells for $2. Okay, and then I could go ahead and calculate the marginal revenue product of labor. And what I did, I just rewrite the marginal revenue product of labor, not as the product of marginal revenue times marginal product of labor, but just as price times MPL. Okay, so, and then by doing this, what I see here is that the marginal product, so this is, for the first worker, right? His marginal product is 6, right? So he added 6 loaves of bread to the total production, and I was able to sell each loaf of bread for $12. So in essence, 6 times 2 is how much this first worker adds. I'm sorry, how much revenue, additional revenue, this worker is adding to this business. Okay, and the same way, the second worker is adding $10 in revenue. Okay, the third worker is adding 4 times 2, or $8 in revenue. So if I am a farm, and I said that, I only hire workers because of the value they bring for me. So the value they're bringing is exactly these. Okay, and if they are only gonna be making me, the first worker only makes me $12 worth of additional revenue, this is the maximum amount that I'd be willing to hire this first worker. Okay, so by doing this, I'm somehow, like, this way, right, I can relate the marginal revenue product of labor and wage together. Okay, so because I'm saying that this number is what I'd be willing to pay, the maximum I'd be willing to pay to hire each worker. For the first one, 12, for the second one, 10, for the third one, 8, for the fourth one, 6. So what this essentially allows me to do is see, or, is to put wage and wage on the vertical axis, and then labor on the horizontal axis, and then I just see that, this is basically the demand for labor, which is equal to the MRPL. So that is why we went into all of this trouble of calculating the marginal revenue product of labor, because it shows us that, the demand for labor is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, so this is what we covered last week, and today we're gonna start looking at the supply side. Okay, so the supply of labor is the number of workers that are willing and able to work at different wages. Okay, remember that, it's the households that are on the supply side now, right? The farms were on the demand side. Now it's about the workers, and how many, how many workers are willing and able to work at different wages. Okay, and what should make sense to you is that the labor supply curve for an industry is upward sloping. Okay, so at the wage of W1, right, the number of workers that are willing and able to work is this quantity at L1, and at this higher wage rate W2, the number of workers that are willing and able to work is at this quantity L2. So as we see here, there is a direct relationship between wage and labor, the wage rate and the quantity of labor. Okay, so directly related, which should make sense, right? Because if you get a higher wage, you're gonna be more willing and able to work, and if you were taking more time off to do some leisurely activities, you're not gonna be you're gonna be more tempted to work more, right, if there is an increase in wage. And vice versa, if wages were to fall, right, the quantity of labor, right, quantity of labor supplied was going to fall as well. So do you guys have any question about this?
No.
Okay, so now let's take a look at this. So the graph that we just saw, okay, that was the industry supply curve, the labor supply curve for the entire industry. Okay, so, or the market, just like we saw in perfectly competitive product side, there were two different things, that the market graph is different than the farm. Okay, so it's the same idea here for the farms in perfectly competitive labor market. They face a perfectly elastic supply curve. Okay, and we get this from this thing. Okay, so remember that this is the market, the perfectly competitive labor market graph. This is the supply of labor, this is the demand for labor, this is labor, and this is wage, and this is equilibrium wage and equilibrium quantity of labor employed. And because this wage rate, we are assuming that we are in a perfectly competitive labor market. One of the assumptions that we made here is that the wage rate that they face is a constant. It's constant. Okay, so because this is constant, what happens for farms is that they can hire as many workers as they can at this wage rate. Okay, but they wouldn't be able to lower the wage, and they have no need to increase the wage, right? So they just have to accept this market wage rate as given, and just hire as many workers as they want at this wage rate. But the whole idea here is that we're no longer talking about the sort of, I guess, different, or the difference here from the perfectly competitive product side was that, on when we were talking about the product market, it was the demand that was perfectly elastic. But here it's the supply of labor, which is perfectly elastic, because at any the farms face an infinite uh, amount of labor or quantity of labor that they can hire at this wage rate. But if they were to increase or decrease the wage even a little bit, right, nobody would want to work for this farm. Okay, people would just go, the workers would just go to some other farm. So they're sort of have to take this market wage rate as given and hire as many workers as they can at this W star. Okay, so the supply of labor in perfectly competitive labor market is perfectly elastic, and it is due to the fixed wage rate that the farms face. Okay, so now, just like we had, we talked about demand, and then we looked at the marginal revenue product of labor on the demand side, which was sort of which was one side of the coin, right? It was looking at it from the revenue perspective of, how much additional revenue does an additional worker bring to the farm. Now we have to look at it from the cost side, because if you hire an extra person, of course, they can do some work for you, but there is also a cost for hiring that person, and that cost is the wage, right? So now we're going to take a look at the cost side, and we're going to compare the two to determine what is the profit maximizing quantity of workers to hire. Okay. So Gabriel, remember you were talking, I think you had a question last class about, why is it that, they want to hire a worker that, brings, why is it that they're only considering the revenue? It's not that they're only considering the revenue. They are considering the profit. The profit is, of course, the ultimate goal, that you want to maximize profit, but they're going to also take a look at the cost perspective of hiring an additional worker. And then we're going to compare the two, like a cost benefit analysis, to see, what is the profit maximizing quantity of labors to hire. Okay.
Thank you.
So marginal factor cost is that idea. Okay, so determine exactly how many workers a farm should hire. They have to consider not only the marginal revenue product, but also the marginal factor cost. So the marginal factor cost is basically something that measures the change in total cost when there is a change in factor quantity. Okay, so because we're only talking about labor here, so essentially the marginal factor cost of labor is how much the total cost changes when there is a change in labor. So if I hire one more additional worker, how much does my total cost change? Okay. So let's take a look at this table and the graph alongside to see if this helps us understand it a little bit more. So let's assume that we're still talking about the bakery, and they can hire from anywhere between 0 to 7 workers. Okay, and because we assume that we are in a perfectly competitive labor market, we know that the wage rate is constant. It's a constant fixed number. It doesn't change no matter how many workers you hire. So for one worker, the wage rate is 6. For 2, it's 6. For 3, it's 6. So you can hire as many workers as you want at the same wage rate. Okay, so this is how we know that this is a perfectly competitive labor market. If these numbers were different, we would no longer be in a perfectly competitive labor market. Okay. And then the total factor cost. How do I find the total factor cost? So the only factor that we have here is labor, right? We're only working with labor inputs. So if I hire one person, right, I have to pay them $6, yes, per hour. So the total cost of hiring that one person is just 1 times 6, which is equal to 6. If I hadn't hired anybody, right, of course, it would just be 0 times 6, which is 0. If I hire 2 people, I have to pay each one of them $6, so it's 2 times 6 or 12. So this is how I find, the numbers in this third column. Okay, it's just multiplying 1 and 2 together to get 3. Okay, and then hopefully you guys have it grilled in your memory in terms of like, how do we find marginal factor cost? So I'm just going to ask somebody how I find out. So how do I find the marginal factor cost for the 5th worker? What numbers did I use to give me this quantity of 6? So Sandra. So this is the marginal factor cost, right? Remember, it's the change in total factor cost divided by the change in labor. Okay, so how would I find this? If I had to, you already have the answer here. I just want to make sure that you guys all know how to calculate this. Does anybody want to help, Sandra?
You need to divide this number and this number.
Divide, or yes, that's correct. So it's not exactly those two, right?
No, like everyone, like 6 and 1, 12 and 2, 18 and 3.
Okay, so for the fifth worker, let's say we're talking about this fifth worker.
No,
What are the two
30
numbers?
and 5 and 6.
Say it again, Max.
30 divided by 5.
Okay, so let's see. Not quite. So what you are doing is you're dividing the total factor cost divided by the number of labors. So that would be like the average factor cost. Okay, so what we're doing is that we're finding the change in total factor cost. Remember, this is change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the total factor cost for the fifth worker minus the total factor cost of the fourth worker, correct? Divide by the change in labor. Okay. Oops.
Oh, so you need to subtract like these numbers.
Yes, exactly. So this is exactly. So anytime you do marginal, remember this is all we're doing, right? So for the fifth worker, it's what? What are those two numbers?
24 and 30.
Yes, good. So 30 minus 24 divided by 1, which is 6, right? So this is how I got this number. So if you were to do that for every single one of this, you would find that every time the marginal factor cost for every labor input comes down to 6. And the reason it happens this way, that the marginal factor cost, right, is equal to the wage rate, is because we're assuming that we're in a perfectly competitive labor market. So remember that. Okay, this is important. This is not gonna they're not going to be equal to each other in any other type of labor market. Okay, it's only because they're in a perfectly competitive labor market and this wage rate is constant. If this wage rate wasn't constant, if these numbers were different than each other, we would never have this situation that they're equal to each other. Okay, everybody with me so far? Hello?
Yes.
Okay. So that is the important takeaway from this, okay, is that in perfectly competitive labor market, we see that the wage rate is equal to the marginal factor cost of labor, which is equal to the supply of labor. Okay, so we just established that here. So we know that the wage is constant and the supply of labor in perfectly competitive labor market is elastic, and because the wage is equal to the marginal factor cost of labor, okay, the supply of labor is then equal to the marginal factor cost of labor. Okay. And what we can do now, after all this, is what it is that we're trying to do here. We want to know what is the profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire. Okay, and we found out the marginal revenue product of labor, right? So that was you can think about it as the benefit of hiring one more worker, and then the marginal factor cost would be the cost of hiring an extra worker. So just like we do with any kind of analysis, or marginal analysis in economics, we have been doing this for a long time, right? We compared marginal benefit, marginal cost. We compared marginal revenue, marginal cost. So now we're doing the same type of, it's the same idea. It's just that the names are different now when we're talking about factor markets. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare this benefit with this cost. Okay, so if I hire, right, so the marginal revenue product of labor, that's essentially how much benefit does an extra worker bring me. If this is if this is greater than the marginal factor cost, what do I do? Do I hire more or less? So think about like marginal revenue and marginal cost. If marginal revenue and was greater than marginal cost, what did we do? Did we produce more or less? More. So it's the same idea here. So marginal revenue is similar or synonymous to this marginal revenue product of labor, which is, think of it as the benefit. So the benefit, if the benefit is greater than the cost, you should hire more, right? If the benefit was less than the cost, you have hired too much, right? You should hire less. So then that this idea, if doing something makes me want to hire more, if doing something makes me want to hire less, it follows that the profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire is this spot where the marginal revenue product of labor is exactly equal to the marginal factor cost. You should hire workers up until this point, and if the cost then exceeds the benefit, you should not hire anymore. If the benefit exceeds the cost, you should hire more. Okay, so it's this should be pretty familiar to you, because this is what we have been doing like all along in econ. When we looked at marginal benefit, marginal cost, when we looked at marginal revenue, marginal cost, this is all we did. Okay. So what we did here is basically, I took the table that I had way in the beginning, about the bakery. So this first 5 columns are the same, right? So this was the marginal revenue product of labor, the marginal revenue, the marginal product, the total product, and then units of labor on those are the first 5 columns. And what I did here is just added the wage rate in the last column 6, and then marginal factor cost on the last column, and these two, right, they're equal to each other, right? And from here, what we see is that the profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire, what we just established, is when you should hire workers when up until they're equal to each other. And from the highlighted row, you can see that happens. These two things become equal to each other when I have hired 4 workers. Okay, because at 0, 1, 2, 3, not 0. Let's not talk about 0. The first worker, second worker, third worker, the marginal revenue product is still greater than the marginal factor cost, which means that I should keep hiring more workers because they bring in more revenue than they cost me. But once I have hired the 4 workers, right, we see that the marginal revenue product is equal to the marginal factor cost. Should I hire that 5th worker? Will I ever hire that 5th worker? No, right? Because the revenue, the additional revenue that he can bring for me is only 4, and it costs me $6, right, to add this extra person. This is how much he costs me, but this is only how much he's going to contribute to the revenue. So of course, I'm not going to hire this next person. I'm going to hire 4 people, and then I'm going to stop. Okay. All right. So this is as far as I wanted to cover for today. Do you guys have any questions?